He didn't lose his empire to a bullet. He lost it to a wheelchair. Vincent was the most feared man in the city until a severed spine turned him into a ghost in his own home. His fiancée, a woman who loved the crown, couldn't stomach the crippled king wearing it. She left him to rot in the corner of a gilded cage, ignoring him for healthy men. But she forgot one thing. The quiet maid she hired to clean his messes was the only one brave enough to look the devil in the eye and treat him like a man. The bullet had entered through the lower back, shattered the T12 vertebra, and taken the world away from Vincent Corvino. Before the hit, his name was a currency. Men lowered their voices when they spoke it. They offered him cuts of shipping routes, construction contracts, and union dues just to keep his gaze directed elsewhere. Now his world was entirely defined by the four walls of the master bedroom in his sprawling, empty estate, and the mechanical hum of an alternating pressure mattress. He couldn't feel his legs. It wasn't a numb emptiness, but a heavy dead weight like 2 bags of wet cement anchored to his pelvis. The doctors called it paraplegia. Vincent called it a tomb. Across the room, Aria sat at her vanity. She was applying a dark crimson lipstick, her jaw-tight eyes focused entirely on her own reflection in the backlit mirror. She wore a silk robe that slipped off one shoulder. Once the sight of her would have stirred him. Now she was just another cold fixture in the room. Dominic called again, Aria said. She didn't look back at the bed. She smacked her lips together, evening out the color. He needs the signatures for the harbor front property. Vincent stared at the ceiling. The plaster was molded into intricate floral patterns. He had memorized every crack. Tell Dominic he can bring the papers here. I'm paralyzed, not brain dead. Aria sighed. It was a sharp, dramatic sound that grated against Vincent's ears. She dropped the lipstick tube onto the marble vanity with a clatter. You know he doesn't want to come up here, Vince. The guys, they don't know how to act around you right now. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them uncomfortable. Vincent turned his head. It was the only part of his body that moved with its old fluidity. He looked at the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 months. The engagement ring on her finger caught the morning light of 5-carat diamond bought with blood and leverage. She hated looking at him. When she did, her eyes darted away, landing on his shoulder, the headboard, the IV, stand anywhere but his face, and certainly never his useless legs beneath the duvet. Then Dominic doesn't get the harbor, Vincent said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Aria stood up, tightening her robe. She finally turned to him, her expression a mix of pity and profound irritation. I don't have time to play messenger between a ghost and the rest of the family, Vincent. I have a fitting at noon. I'll tell the staff to bring up your lunch. She walked out without waiting for a response. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Silence flooded the room, thick and suffocating. Vincent closed his eyes. The rage was still there, burning hot in his chest, but it had nowhere to go. A king without an army was just a target. A king who couldn't stand was a joke. He gripped the edge of the bedsheet with hands that could still crush a man's windpipe. His upper body was stronger than ever, overcompensating for the dead weight below. But what good was muscle if you couldn't leave the bed? 20 minutes later, the door handle turned again. Not a sharp twist, but a quiet, respectful click. A woman stepped into the room. She was carrying a tray with a basin of warm water, a stack of clean towels, and his morning medications. Her name was Tessa. Tessa was not part of his world. She didn't wear designer clothes, she didn't smell of expensive cloying perfume, and she didn't look at him like he was a rotting corpse. She wore a simple dark blue uniform. Her brown hair was tied back in a messy knot, and there were dark circles under her eyes, speaking of double shifts, and a life lived on the edge of a bank account balance. She walked to the bedside table and set the tray down. "Morning, Mr. Corvino," she said. Her voice was flat, practical. Vincent didn't answer. He rarely did. He watched her. Tessa didn't seem to care about his silence. She moved with an efficiency that fascinated him. The other nurses and maids Arya had hired over the past 6 months either trembled when they approached him, terrified of his reputation, or they patronized him, speaking in high, soft voices, as if the bullet had damaged his hearing and intellect. Tessa did neither. She pulled the duvet down. Vincent's jaw tightened. He hated this part. He hated the exposure. His legs were thinning, the muscle atrophy setting in, despite the physical therapy he endured 3 times a week. Tessa didn't hesitate. She didn't wince. She took his right ankle, supporting the joint with professional ease, and began to rotate it, putting the dead limb through its range of motion to prevent contractures. Her hands were warm, her grip firm. She wasn't afraid of breaking him, and she wasn't disgusted by him. "Left foot is swelling a bit," she noted, speaking more to herself than to him. "I'll elevate it after the bath." Vincent watched her face. No makeup. A small scar just above her left eyebrow. The quiet concentration in her eyes. "Why are you here?" Vincent asked. The words scraped out of his throat. Tessa paused, holding his knee. She looked up at him. "It's Tuesday. I work Tuesdays." "I mean, why do you work here?" He clarified his dark eyes, locking onto hers. "In this house. With me. The others usually quit by week 2. You've been here a month." Tessa held his gaze. She didn't flinch. "You pay $35 an hour. The agency takes 10, I keep 25. I have rent and my sister has medical bills. That's why I'm here." She went back to stretching his leg. No grand declarations of loyalty, no sycophantic praise, just raw, unvarnished truth. Vincent felt a strange foreign sensation in his chest, a crack in the ice. He looked down at her hands, strong and steady, working over muscles he could no longer feel, keeping the blood flowing in a body everyone else had already buried. 25 isn't enough," Vincent said quietly. Tessa reached for a warm, damp towel. "It's better than minimum wage, Mr. Corvino. Can you lean forward for me?" He grabbed the trapeze bar hanging over the bed and pulled his heavy torso up. Tessa washed his back, the warm cloth, soothing the tight muscles around his shoulders. For the first time in months, Vincent didn't feel like a piece of broken furniture. He felt briefly like a man. By the 3rd month of Tessa's employment, a silent routine had established itself. Arya was a ghost. She slept in the guest wing, now claiming Vincent's medical equipment was too noisy for her to get adequate rest. She spent his money with reckless abandon, hosting lavish lunches, expanding her wardrobe, and holding court with the wives of his underbosses. She was securing her position, playing the grieving but resilient fiancé. She was waiting for him to die, or at least fade into complete obscurity, so she could inherit the influence without the inconvenience of his ruined body. Tessa was the opposite. She was the gravity that kept Vincent tethered to the earth. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. The sky outside the towering bedroom windows was the color of bruised iron. Vincent sat in his customized wheelchair, staring out at the manicured lawns turning to mud. "They're having a meeting downstairs," Vincent said. He didn't turn his head. He knew Tessa was in the room, quietly sorting his laundry. "I know," Tessa replied, folding a dark shirt. "I saw the cars pull up. 6 black SUVs. They blocked the delivery entrance." "My capos," Vincent murmured. "Dominic, Paulie, Frank. They're carving up the south side, and they didn't invite me." He gripped the armrests of his chair. The leather creaked under his massive hands. He could imagine the scene in his mahogany-paneled dining room. Cigars, bourbon, the low murmur of men negotiating territory that belonged to him. Arya would be there, pouring drinks, smiling at Dominic, laughing at Paulie's jokes, playing the gracious host, acting as the gatekeeper to a gate that had already been locked against him. "You're the boss, aren't you?" Tessa asked. She walked over, placing a folded stack of clothes in the dresser. "I was," Vincent said, the bitterness thick on his tongue. "Now I'm just the bank. They use my name to keep the streets quiet, but they don't answer to me. A wolf pack doesn't follow a crippled alpha." Tessa closed the dresser drawer. She walked over to his chair. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him he was still strong or that things would get better. She dealt in reality, just like he did. "Your catheter needs emptying," she said, pulling on a pair of blue latex gloves. Vincent closed his eyes, a familiar wave of humiliation washing over him. It never went away. The indignity of not being able to control his own body, of having a woman he barely knew handle his most basic intimate functions. With the men downstairs dividing his empire, the reality of his physical dependence felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He let his head fall back against the headrest, bracing for the shame. But Tessa was quick. She was clinical, yet gentle. She knelt beside his chair, unhooking the bag strapped to his calf. She didn't make a face. She didn't rush, nor did she dawdle. "You're angry," Tessa said quietly, emptying the fluid into a basin. "I'm a lot of things," Vincent said, his voice tight. "You're letting them treat you like you're dead," Tessa stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. She wiped the valve with an alcohol pad and reattached it to his leg, securing the Velcro straps so they wouldn't chafe his skin. Vincent opened his eyes and glared at her. "What do you suggest, Tessa? Should I roll down there and run them over? Should I challenge Dominic to a fist fight? I can't feel my goddamn legs." Tessa stood up, pulling off the gloves and throwing them in the biohazard bin. She walked to the bathroom, washed her hands, and came back. She stood in front of his wheelchair, crossing her arms. "You can't feel your legs," Tessa agreed. "But your mouth works fine. Your brain works fine. You built whatever it is you have because you were smart, not just because you could walk." Vincent stared at her. Nobody spoke to him like this. Before the accident, a subordinate taking this tone would have found themselves in the trunk of a car. Now, from this tired, underpaid maid, it felt like the first breath of clean air he'd had in a year. "Arya tells them I'm too weak for visitors," Vincent said. "Arya tells them what suits Arya," Tessa countered. She leaned down slightly, bringing her face level with his. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with green, and completely devoid of fear. "She treats you like a burden, Mr. Corvino, because you let her. You stay up here in this room like a prisoner. You eat when they tell you, you sleep when they tell you. And what do you care?" Vincent shot back his chest, rising and falling heavily. "You get paid either way." "I care because I hate watching people give up," Tessa said, her voice dropping a register hardening. "My sister gave up. She stopped taking her meds, stopped doing her therapy. She let the sickness win because it was easier than fighting. I watch you sit in this chair, a man who supposedly used to run a city, and you're letting a woman who can't even look you in the eye dig your grave." She didn't wait for his reaction. She picked up the basin and walked toward the bathroom. Vincent watched her go. His heart was hammering against his ribs. It wasn't the slow, lethargic beat of a dying man. It was the frantic, aggressive rhythm of a cornered animal, realizing it still had teeth. "Tessa!" he called out. She paused at the bathroom door, looking back over her shoulder. "Get me dressed," Vincent commanded. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by cold steel. "The navy suit, the one Taylor made before the hit. And fetch my watch." Tessa's lips twitched upward into the ghost of a smile. "Yes, sir." The elevator hummed as it carried Vincent down to the ground floor. The house had been retrofitted with it shortly after he was discharged from the hospital, an ugly glass tube ruining the aesthetics of the grand staircase. He had used it exactly twice. He sat rigid in his wheelchair wearing the navy Brioni suit. It was a little loose around the thighs now, but the jacket fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. Tessa had spent 20 minutes making sure he looked immaculate. His hair was slicked back, his jaw cleanly shaved. He wore his Patek Philippe watch. He looked like Vincent Corvino again, save for the wheels beneath him. Tessa stood behind the chair, her hands resting lightly on the push handles. "I can push myself," Vincent said quietly as the elevator neared the ground floor. "I know," Tessa replied. "But a king doesn't push his own carriage." Vincent didn't smile, but a profound warmth settled in his chest. He reached back blindly, his large hand finding hers where it rested on the handle. He squeezed her fingers once, a silent acknowledgement. She squeezed back, grounding him. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. The low hum of conversation from the formal dining room drifted down the hallway, punctuated by the clinking of crystal glasses and raucous laughter. Vincent rolled himself forward out of the elevator, Tessa walking half a step behind him, a silent shadow. As they approached the open double doors of the dining room, the laughter grew louder. He stopped just outside the threshold. Inside, 10 men sat around his custom-built mahogany table. Dominic, his underboss, sat at the head, his seat. Dominic was smoking a cigar, his feet kicked up on the rung of a neighboring chair. Aria was leaning over him, pouring a dark amber liquid into his glass, her hand lingering on Dominic's shoulder, a second too long. "So I told the union rep you either take the deal or the concrete trucks stop rolling on Tuesday," Dominic was saying, waving his cigar. The table erupted in chuckles. Vincent pushed the wheels of his chair. He rolled into the room. The thick carpets silenced his entry, but it didn't matter. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. One by one, the men noticed him. The laughter died in their throats. Glasses were slowly lowered to the table. Men who had killed without remorse suddenly found themselves staring at their plates, the table, the walls. Dominic froze the cigar halfway to his mouth. Aria gasped, taking a quick step back from Dominic, nearly dropping the heavy crystal decanter. "Vincent," she stammered, her face pale. What are you doing down here? The doctor said you need rest." "The doctor isn't my boss, Aria," Vincent said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly, cutting through the cigar smoke and the silence. He rolled forward, directly toward the head of the table. Dominic stared at him, a flicker of panic behind his eyes, before he hurriedly scrambled to his feet. He nearly knocked his chair over in his haste to get out of the way. "Vince," Dominic said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "We didn't expect you. Aria said you were having a bad day. I was having a quiet day, too," Vincent said, pulling his wheelchair into the space Dominic had just vacated at the head of the table. He looked around at the faces of his crew. Poorly Frank, Silvio. They were sweating. "Until I heard rats in the walls." The silence was absolute. Aria stepped forward, her heels clicking nervously. "Vincent, please. You're embarrassing yourself. Let's get you back upstairs." "Tessa," she snapped, noticing the maid standing quietly near the doorway. "Take him back to his room immediately." Tessa didn't move. She kept her eyes on Vincent. "Tessa works for me, Aria," Vincent said smoothly. "Not for you." He reached for a glass of water on the table. His hand, usually steady, trembled slightly from the adrenaline and the immense physical effort of sitting unsupported in the suit. As his fingers wrapped around the heavy crystal, his grip slipped. The glass tipped, fell and shattered against the mahogany table, sending water and shards cascading onto his lap and the floor. A collective breath was drawn in the room. This was the moment, the confirmation of his weakness. Dominic's eyes flashed with a brief, ugly triumph, a cripple who couldn't even hold a glass of water. Arya let out a sound of absolute disgust. "For God's sake, Vincent, look at what you've done. You're making a mess of everything. I told you you shouldn't be down here." She looked at Dominic, rolling her eyes, in an appeal for sympathy. Vincent sat frozen. The water soaked into his expensive trousers. He couldn't feel it, but he knew how it looked. The humiliation threatened to choke him. He had gambled his dignity, and he had lost in front of his entire crew. He closed his eyes, preparing to turn the chair around and retreat to his tomb. Then motion. Tessa was suddenly at his side. She didn't have a towel. She didn't call for the other staff. She picked up a pristine white cloth napkin from the table, ignoring the stares of the deadliest men in Chicago, and knelt beside his chair. She began to wipe the water from his trousers, meticulously, picking up the shards of glass. "Leave it," Vincent growled, his pride bleeding out. "Just get me out of here." Tessa paused. She looked up at him, ignoring the audience. "A spilled glass of water doesn't drown a man, Mr. Corvino," she said, her voice clear and calm. She stood up, placing the damp napkin and the broken glass onto a silver tray. She turned to face the table, her gaze sweeping over the hardened criminals and settling on Arya. "Mr. Corvino would prefer bourbon," Tessa said, staring directly at the fiancé. "Since you have the decanter, Miss Harrington, would you pour it, or should I?" The audacity of the maid struck the room like a physical blow. Arya's mouth opened, but no words came out. Dominic stared at Tessa as if she had grown a second head. Vincent looked at Tessa standing tall by his side, defending his dignity when his own body had betrayed him. She wasn't just a maid. She was a soldier. His soldier. He leaned forward in his chair, resting his forearms on the table, the weakness vanishing, replaced by a cold, terrifying authority. He looked at Dominic. "Pour the drink, Arya." Vincent ordered, never taking his eyes off his underboss. "And then pack your bags. You're moving out tonight." Arya didn't leave quietly. The house echoed with the sound of slamming drawers and shattering perfume bottles. In the dining room, the men had filed out fast. They didn't run, because made men don't run, but their exit was a hasty, synchronized retreat. Dominic was the last to leave. He had paused at the door, trying to salvage the sudden collapse of his coup. He offered a tight, plastic smile. "Glad to see you out of bed, boss. We were just keeping the seat warm, keeping the engine running." Vincent hadn't looked at him. He just stared at the amber liquid in his glass. "The engine is mine, Dom. If I catch you behind the wheel again, I'll break your hands. Now get out of my house." Dominic's jaw had clenched, a fleeting look of pure malice crossing his features before he nodded and slipped out into the rain. Now, an hour later, the front door stood open. Two of the estate's security guards were hauling Arya's matched Louis Vuitton luggage out to a waiting town car. Vincent sat at the head of the dining table. The spilled water was gone. The broken glass was swept away. The only proof of his moment of weakness was the damp chill seeping into his trousers, a sensation he could only feel at the very top of his thighs, where the nerve damage frayed into healthy tissue. High heels clicked violently against the marble floor of the foyer. Arya stormed into the dining room, a trench coat pulled tight around her waist. Her face was flushed, her perfect makeup marred by furious, genuine tears. It was the most real emotion he had seen from her in 6 months. "You're making a mistake!" Arya spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you can just throw me out after everything I've sacrificed for you." Sacrificed. Vincent turned his wheelchair slightly to face her. You drank my wine, spent my money, and auditioned my underboss for my job while I lay in a bed upstairs. The only thing you sacrificed was your dignity. Arya sneered, crossing her arms. She looked down at his legs, a cruel, practiced weapon. You need me. Look at you, Vincent. You're half a man. You think Dominic respects you. You think any of them do. They're laughing at you. Without me playing the loyal wife to smooth things over, they'll eat you alive. Let them try, Vincent said smoothly. You're pathetic, she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. She looked past him, her eyes landing on Tessa, who stood quietly near the credenza. And you. You think you're special because you wiped up his mess. You're a maid. When he finally chokes on his own spit, you'll be out on the street with nothing. Tessa didn't blink. She didn't shrink under the wealthy woman's glare. She picked up a dry microfiber cloth and began to polish the mahogany table where the water had spilled. Drive safe, Miss Harrington, Tessa said flatly. The roads are slick. Arya let out a breathless scoff of disbelief, spun on her heel, and marched out of the house. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with a finality that rattled the crystal in the chandelier. Silence reclaimed the room, the grand, echoing quiet of a tomb. But for the first time in a year, Vincent didn't feel like a corpse. He looked over at Tessa. She was still wiping the table, her movements methodical and calm. You just made a powerful enemy, Vincent noted. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. Arya comes from money. Her father has judges in his pocket. I clean toilets for a living, Mr. Corvino, Tessa replied, not looking up. I'm not afraid of a woman whose biggest hardship is a chipped manicure, Vincent exhaled slowly. It was the closest thing to a laugh he'd produced since the bullet hit him. He reached for the glass of bourbon Arya had poured before she was banished. He picked it up. His hand was steady now. The tremor of exhaustion and adrenaline had passed. He took a slow sip, the alcohol burning a clean path down his throat. We need to change the locks, Vincent said. Already told the guards, Tessa said, throwing the cloth over her shoulder. They're bringing a locksmith at 8. He studied her, the dark blue scrubs, the tired eyes, the absolute lack of pretense. You stepped out of your lane tonight, Tessa. You embarrassed my underboss. You ordered my fiancé out of the house. Tessa finally looked at him. Do you want me to pack my bags, too? No. Vincent set the glass down. I want you to move my office downstairs. The transition took 3 days. Vincent refused to go back to the master bedroom. That room was a symbol of his surrender. Instead, he claimed the massive wood-paneled library on the ground floor. It had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the Chicago skyline. Tessa coordinated the logistics. She directed the burly security guards to dismantle his hospital bed upstairs and rebuild it in the corner of the library behind a heavy leather privacy screen. She had them haul his massive oak desk out of storage and position it in the center of the room. Vincent watched her work. He sat in his chair, a laptop resting on his dead thighs, reconnecting with a world he had ignored for too long. He sent encrypted messages. He checked offshore bank accounts. He reviewed the ledgers Dominic had supposedly been managing. The numbers were bleeding. Dominic had been skimming, getting sloppy, assuming the boss would never look at the books again. Lift on 3. Tessa's voice cut through his thoughts. Vincent set the laptop on the desk. It was noon. Time for his pressure relief and range of motion exercises. Tessa wheeled him behind the leather screen. She locked the brakes on his chair. This was the brutal reality of his life, the ugly mechanical maintenance of a broken body. Before he had hated it. He had stared at the wall, wishing he were dead, while a carousel of terrified nurses handled him. With Tessa it was different. It was an unspoken partnership. She unbuttoned his dress shirt. He didn't wear pajamas anymore. If he was going to run his family, he dressed the part, even if he couldn't walk. "Lean forward," she instructed. Vincent gripped the armrests and pushed his torso forward. Tessa unclasped the heavy leather belt that kept his core stable in the chair. She reached behind him, her hands pressing firmly against the base of his spine, checking the skin for the early red warning signs of bed sores. Her touch was clinical, but not cold. It was the touch of someone who gave a damn whether he lived or rotted. "Skin looks good," she murmured, standing up. "No breakdown. You're sitting straighter." "I have a reason to," Vincent said. She stepped in front of him to adjust his legs. She knelt, lifting his right leg to place it on the footrest perfectly. As she leaned in, her face was inches from his chest. He could smell cheap vanilla soap and the faint metallic scent of the cleaning supplies she used. It was infinitely better than Aria's suffocating Chanel. "I looked into your agency file," Vincent said softly, looking down at the top of her head. Tessa froze. She slowly lowered his leg and looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. "You hacked my employment file." "I'm a mob boss, Tessa. I don't hack. I pay people to look." Vincent held her gaze. "Your sister, Sarah. She has multiple sclerosis." Tessa's jaw tightened. She stood up, taking a step back, wiping her hands on her scrub pants, as if to put distance between them. "That's none of your business." "It became my business, the second you stood between me and a table full of killers," Vincent replied, his voice calm an anchor in the sudden tension. "The medical bills are drowning you. The agency takes a third of your pay, and you're working 60 hours a week just to keep her in a facility that barely changes her sheets." "Stop," Tessa said, her voice cracking slightly before she reinforced it with steel. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Corvino. I work for my money. I take care of my own. It's not pity." Vincent reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick white envelope and tossed it onto the edge of the desk. It landed with a heavy, distinct thud. "That's $50,000 in cash, clean money, from a legitimate real estate holding." Tessa stared at the envelope. She didn't move toward it. "What is this severance?" "It's a retainer," Vincent said. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together in his lap. "You quit the agency today. You work directly for me. Your salary is $10,000 a month. Sarah gets moved to the Oakstone Clinic in Evanston tomorrow. Best neurological care in the state. I've already made the call. They have a room waiting." Tessa's breath hitched. Oakstone. It was the gold standard, a place she had driven past, but never dared to call, because the waitlist was years long and the cost was astronomical. She looked from the envelope to Vincent. Her eyes were wide, the cynical armor she wore, slipping for just a fraction of a second, revealing the exhausted, desperate woman underneath. "Why?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Because I need someone I can trust," Vincent said simply. "Dominic has the captains. Aria has the politicians. I have a wheelchair and a bank account. I need a right hand. Someone to manage this house, manage my care, and keep their mouth shut." Tessa stared at him. "You're buying my loyalty." "I'm securing an asset," Vincent corrected, a faint smirk touching his lips. "And I'm paying you what you're actually worth." Tessa looked at the envelope again. Slowly she reached out and picked it up. She didn't open it. She just held it, the weight of it anchoring her. She looked back at Vincent, the vulnerability gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying resolve. "Oakstone," she confirmed. "Tomorrow morning." Vincent nodded. Tessa slipped the envelope into her pocket. "Then I guess you're my only boss now. What do we do first?" "First," Vincent said, turning his chair toward the glowing screens of his monitors, We cut the head off a snake. Dominic was not a stupid man, but he was an impatient one. Impatience breeds sloppiness. It had been 4 days since the dinner incident. Dominic had kept his distance, offering no apologies and making no visits. Instead, he made a move. Vincent sat in the dim light of the library, staring at the flashing cursor on his secure messaging app. The message was from Leo, an old-school dock foreman who had been loyal to Vincent's father. 3 containers moving tonight. Pier 4. Dom bypassed the union. No cut for the family. Using Russian muscle. Vincent's jaw muscles feathered. Dominic wasn't just skimming anymore. He was going rogue. Moving product through Vincent's territory, using foreign muscle and cutting the Corvino family out of the profits entirely. It was a blatant declaration of war. Before the bullet, Vincent would have driven down to Pier, for himself put a gun to Dominic's head and thrown him into the lake. Now he had to use his mind. He had to remind them that the brain was the deadliest organ in the body. "Tessa," Vincent called out. She emerged from the hallway carrying a tray with his evening medications and a glass of scotch. She had traded the blue scrubs for a pair of dark slacks and a tailored black button-down. She looked less like a maid and more like an executive assistant. "Set up the secure line," Vincent ordered. "Call Dominic. Tell him to come to the house." Tessa set the tray down. She didn't ask questions. She picked up the encrypted satellite phone Vincent kept in the top drawer. She dialed the number from memory. Vincent watched her. She held the phone to her ear, her face completely passive. "Dominic, it's Tessa. Mr. Corvino needs to see you at the estate. Now." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Her eyes flicked to Vincent. "He doesn't care if you're eating dinner." He said now. "Come to the library entrance." She hung up. "He's pissed," Tessa reported, setting the phone down. "Said he'll be here in 20. "Good, let him be pissed." Vincent rolled his chair over to the heavy oak desk. He opened a lower drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, tossing it onto the desk. "He thinks because I can't walk, I can't reach him." 25 minutes later, the heavy library doors swung open. Dominic stepped inside. He wore a sharp grey suit, his top button undone. He looked around the room, taking in the monitors, the medical screen in the corner, the thick files on the desk. He looked uneasy. The library didn't feel like a sick room. It felt like a war room. Tessa stood behind Vincent's chair, her hands clasped behind her back. "You called boss," Dominic said, walking toward the desk. He didn't sit. He stood tall, a subtle assertion of physical dominance over the man in the chair. "I was in the middle of a sit-down with the South Side crew, trying to keep the peace since you've been out of commission." Vincent didn't look up immediately. He slowly opened the leather ledger. He flipped a few pages. "Pier 4, Dom," Vincent said softly. Dominic stopped halfway to the desk. His shoulders stiffened. "What about it?" 3 containers. Moving tonight. Bypassing the union using Russian muscle. Vincent looked up, his eyes, flat dark and devoid of any humanity. "You're running private shipments through my port, using my infrastructure and pocketing the gross." Dominic let out a short, nervous laugh. He ran a hand through his hair. "Vince, you got it wrong. It's a side thing. Small potatoes. I was going to bring you in on the back end once the logistics were smoothed out. You've been stressed, man. I was handling it." "You're stealing from me," Vincent corrected. His voice never raised above a conversational tone. That was what made him terrifying. "You're using the power vacuum you think exists to line your own pockets and build alliances with the Bratva." Dominic's face hardened. The pretense of respect vanished. He took a step closer to the desk, leaning his knuckles on the wood. He looked down at Vincent. "Let's be real here, Vince. Dominic said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're done. You sit in this chair all day, having your nurse wipe your ass. The men respect strength. They respect a guy who can actually stand up and fight for them. You think you can hold the city together with a laptop and a phone? The Russians are moving in. If I don't make deals with them, they'll roll right over us. I'm saving this family." "You're a parasite," Vincent said smoothly. Dominic's face flushed purple. He reached inside his suit jacket. Tessa didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply shifted her weight, dropping her hand into her slacks pocket, wrapping her fingers around the cold steel of the snub-nosed .38 Vincent had given her 2 days ago. But Vincent didn't need a gun. "Pull it, Dom," Vincent whispered, staring directly into Dominic's eyes. "Pull the gun. Shoot a paralyzed man in his own home. See how long you last on the street. The commission will have you skinned alive before sunrise for breaking the rules." Dominic hesitated, his hand hovering over his holster. His chest heaved. He was trapped. He couldn't kill the boss without sanction, and he couldn't back down without looking weak. Vincent reached forward and tapped a key on his laptop. "I don't need to stand up to crush you, Dominic," Vincent said. "I just need a Wi-Fi connection." He turned the laptop monitor around so Dominic could see it. On the screen was a live feed of Pier 4. The 3 shipping containers were sitting under the halogen lights. Surrounding them were 20 heavily armed men wearing black tactical gear. But they weren't Russians. They were the Corvino family enforcers led by Paulie and Frank. Dominic's face drained of color. "What did you do?" "I made a few phone calls," Vincent said, leaning back in his wheelchair. "I told Paulie and Frank that you were selling them out to the Russians. I showed them the bank transfers you've been making to offshore accounts money you stole from their cuts. They were very disappointed in you, Dom." Dominic stared at the screen, watching his illegal shipment being seized by the very men he thought he controlled. His breathing became shallow, panicked. He looked at Vincent, finally seeing the monster that had built the empire in the first place. The wheelchair disappeared. All Dominic saw was the devil. "Vince?" Dominic stammered, taking a step back. "Vince, come on. We grew up together. I was just trying to keep the money flowing. Tessa." Vincent said, not taking his eyes off his underboss. "Yes, Mr. Corvino." "Call the front gate. Tell the guards to let Dominic's car through." Vincent paused, letting the silence stretch until it threatened to snap. "He's leaving Chicago tonight. If he's still in the city limits by sunrise, call Paulie. Tell him to handle it." Dominic swallowed hard. He looked from the laptop to Vincent to Tessa, standing like a stone sentinel behind the chair. He had been beaten without a single punch being thrown. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the library, his posture defeated. His empire crumbled into dust. When the door clicked shut, the heavy tension in the room finally broke. Vincent exhaled, rolling his neck, trying to release the agonizing tension in his upper back. He looked at the screen, watching his men secure the harbor. He was back. He was broken, he was confined to a chair, but he was the king again. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was a light touch, but firm. He looked up. Tessa was looking down at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, silent respect. "Your scotch is getting warm, boss," she said softly. Vincent looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in a genuine, tired smile. He reached up and placed his large hand over hers, where it rested on his shoulder. "Then pour me another one," he said. Winter hit Chicago like a hammer. The wind, coming off Lake Michigan, rattled the heavy reinforced glass of the library windows, but inside the temperature was strictly controlled. 3 months had passed since Dominic's exile. The city's underworld had held its breath, waiting for the Corvino family to tear itself apart. Instead, The family tightened its grip. Paulie and Frank, terrified by the reach of a boss who never left his house, fell in line with religious devotion. The money flowed, the streets were quiet, and Tessa was no longer just the maid. She was the gatekeeper. Men who had spent their lives breaking kneecaps and intimidating witnesses now stood nervously in the foyer, waiting for a 30-year-old woman in tailored slacks to grant them an audience. She managed Vincent's schedule, his medical routines, and his communication. But the body is not a machine, and a severed spine is not a clean break. It is a chaotic, misfiring circuit board. It happened on a Tuesday night. The house was quiet, the security detail patrolling the perimeter in the snow. Vincent was at his desk, reviewing the week's laundering receipts from a chain of South Side dry cleaners. Tessa was sitting on the leather sofa, near the fireplace, reading a hardcover novel. Without warning, Vincent's right leg shot straight out. His knee locked with a violent, sickening crack of cartilage. His foot hit the underside of the heavy oak desk hard enough to rattle the monitors. Vincent let out a sharp, breathless grunt. He grabbed the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. Tessa dropped her book. She crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to her knees beside his chair. "Spasm?" she asked, her voice tight, already reaching for his locked leg. "Yeah," Vincent ground out through clenched teeth. Sweat was instantly beading on his forehead. "Bad one." He couldn't feel the pain of the impact against the desk, but he could feel the terrifying phantom pressure in his hips. His brain was sending frantic signals to muscles that refused to listen, causing them to contract with bone-breaking force. His left leg jerked, kicking out and hitting the desk again. "Move back," Tessa ordered. Vincent unlocked the brakes and pushed the chair away from the desk, giving her room. Tessa threw her weight over his thighs. She didn't treat him like fragile glass. She knew better. She wrapped her arms around his shins, pressing his violently jerking legs down toward the floor, using her entire body weight to fight the severe spasticity. "Breathe, Vince," she commanded, her face inches from his knees. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Force your heart rate down. His chest heaved. He stared down at her. She was struggling, her boots slipping on the Persian rug, as his powerful, uncontrollable leg muscles fought against her hold. The indignity of it clawed at his throat. He was the most powerful man in the city, and right now he was entirely at the mercy of his own broken nervous system. "Let go." Vincent gasped, his voice thick with sudden self-loathing rage. "Just let it snap, I don't care." "Shut up," Tessa snapped back. It wasn't a request, it was an order. She shifted her grip, pressing her forearm down on his quads. "You're not giving up in this room. Not on my watch. Breathe." For 10 agonizing minutes, they fought a war in the middle of the library. Vincent fought the panic in his chest. Tessa fought the raw mechanical force of his dead limbs. Slowly, the misfiring nerves exhausted themselves. The violent jerks faded into faint tremors, and finally his legs went heavy and slack against the footrests. Tessa stayed kneeling for a long moment, breathing hard. Her hair had fallen out of its clip, hanging around her face in damp strands. Vincent slumped back against the leather headrest, closing his eyes. The adrenaline crash left him hollowed out, stripped to the bone. "I hate this," Vincent whispered. The absolute vulnerability in his voice was something no one else had ever heard. Not his capos, not his father, and certainly not Arya. "I am a prisoner in a dead meat sack." Tessa slowly sat back on her heels. She looked up at him. She didn't offer a hollow comfort. She didn't tell him he was brave. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead and stood up. She walked around the desk, stopping right beside his chair. "Look at me," Tessa said softly. Vincent opened his eyes. They were dark, exhausted, and filled with a rare, bitter defeat. Tessa reached out. She didn't touch his shoulder or his arm. She placed her warm palm against his cheek. It was a fiercely intimate gesture. Vincent's breath hitched. He leaned into her hand just a fraction of an inch, anchored by the heat of her skin. "You are not a meat sack," Tessa said, her voice a low, steady rumble. "You survived a hit that was meant to put you in the ground. You took a city back without firing a single bullet. The men outside this door don't fear your legs, Vincent. They fear your mind. They fear you." Vincent stared into her hazel eyes. The clinical distance they usually maintained was gone, burned away by the adrenaline and the quiet intimacy of the empty room. "And you?" Vincent asked, his voice dropping to a rough rasp. "What do you see?" Tessa's thumb lightly brushed along his jawline. The touch sent a shockwave through his chest that had nothing to do with damaged nerves. "I see the only man I've ever respected," she answered. She didn't pull away, and he didn't ask her to. For a long, heavy moment, the mob boss and the maid existed in a space entirely their own, bound by the trauma they managed together every single day. Vincent reached up his large, calloused hand, wrapping over hers where it rested against his face. He didn't need to speak. The grip of his fingers said everything. "Stay." Tessa squeezed his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." Aria Harrington was a woman who didn't understand the concept of a final warning. Stripped of her status as the future queen of the Corvino Empire, she found herself an outcast in the very social circles she used to rule. The wives of the underbosses stopped returning her calls. The boutique owners no longer offered her champagne. She was a pariah tossed out by a crippled man, which made the humiliation absolute. And she blamed the maid. It was a Thursday afternoon when the secure phone on Vincent's desk buzzed. Tessa picked it up. She listened for 30 seconds, her face turning entirely to stone. "Understood, Dr. Aris. I'll handle it," Tessa said, and hung up. Vincent looked up from his laptop. "Trouble at the clinic." Tessa stood perfectly still, her hands resting flat on the mahogany desk. "Aria is at Oakstone. She brought her father. Arthur Harrington is threatening to pull his foundation's funding from the clinic if my sister isn't discharged by sundown." Vincent's eyes darkened. A lethal, quiet calm settled over him. "She went after Sarah. She thinks I'm the reason she lost her crown," Tessa said, her voice devoid of panic, but laced with a cold, terrifying anger. "She thinks if she squeezes my family, I'll break. I'll leave you, or I'll betray you." Vincent reached into his desk drawer. "Arthur Harrington is a federal judge. He thinks his gavel makes him bulletproof." He pulled out a thick, black flash drive and tossed it onto the center of the desk. "He likes to play poker in private rooms above the gold exchange. He likes to lose. He owes $3 million to a loan shark operating out of Cicero. A shark who happens to kick up to me." Tessa looked at the flash drive. "Everything is on there," Vincent continued softly. "The wire transfers the photos of Harrington meeting with the bookies, the audio files of him promising lenient sentencing in exchange for debt forgiveness. It's enough to put him in federal prison for 20 years and bankrupt the entire Harrington family." Vincent looked at Tessa. He didn't offer to send Paulie. He didn't offer to make a phone call. He offered her the weapon. "Do you want me to handle it?" Vincent asked. Tessa picked up the flash drive. The plastic felt warm in her hand. She looked at the man in the wheelchair. He was trusting her with the nuclear option. "No," Tessa said. "I'll take the armored SUV. Tell Paulie to drive me." 30 minutes later, the black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the glass-fronted entrance of the Oakstone Clinic in Evanston. The snow was falling hard now, accumulating on the sidewalks. Inside the sleek modern lobby, Aria was standing near the reception desk, wearing a white mink coat, her arms crossed. Next to her stood her father, Judge Arthur Harrington, an imposing man with silver hair and a permanent scowl. The hospital administrator looked panicked, trapped between a powerful donor and medical ethics. Tessa walked through the automatic sliding doors. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She wore a black wool peacoat over her slacks, her boots clicking sharply against the tile. Paulie, an absolute mountain of a man with a broken nose and cold eyes, walked 2 paces behind her. Arya saw her and smiled. It was a vicious, triumphant smirk. "Well," Arya said loudly, drawing the attention of the waiting room, "the maid finally shows up. Did you bring your mop, Tessa? They're about to have a room to clean out." Tessa ignored her. She walked straight up to Judge Harrington. She didn't look up at him. She made him look down at her. "Judge Harrington," Tessa said flatly, "I don't speak to the help." The judge sneered, glancing at the administrator. "Have security remove this woman and process the discharge papers for Sarah Rossi immediately." Tessa reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the black flash drive and held it up between her index and middle fingers. $3 million is a lot of money to lose on a pair of 8s, Arthur," Tessa said. The judge froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and grey under the fluorescent lights. Arya frowned, looking between her father and the maid. "What is she talking about, Dad?" Tessa didn't look at Arya. She kept her eyes locked on the judge. "Cicero is a rough neighborhood for a man of your standing, especially when you start trading federal sentences to clear your markers with Tommy the Rat Valenti." Arthur Harrington's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands began to tremble. "You have a choice," Tessa said, her voice dropping to a conversational murmur that only the judge Arya and Paulie could hear. "You can walk out of this lobby right now, go back to your mansion, and forget the name Sarah Rossi. You will never set foot in this clinic again. You will never say the name Vincent Corvino again. If I even sense you breathing in our direction." Tessa stepped half an inch closer, the absolute authority of the Mafia backing her every word. "This drive goes to the FBI, the Chicago Tribune, and the Judicial Ethics Board, and while you're sitting in a concrete cell, the men you owe that money to will come looking for your daughter to settle the debt." Arya finally understood. The blood rushed from her face. "Dad, what is she saying? Have her arrested." "Shut up, Arya," the judge hissed, his voice cracking. He stared at Tessa, swallowing hard. He saw the cold, dead eyes of the enforcer standing behind her, and he saw the absolute lack of bluff in Tessa's face. He was beaten, completely and utterly destroyed. "We're leaving," Arthur Harrington said thickly. He grabbed his daughter's arm, his fingers digging into the expensive mink coat. "Dad, you can't be serious. You're letting a maid talk to you like this," Arya screeched, fighting his grip. "She's not a maid, you stupid girl," the judge snarled in terrified realization. "Walk." Tessa stood in the center of the lobby, watching as the judge practically dragged his screaming daughter out the sliding glass doors and into the freezing snow. The hospital administrator let out a shaky breath, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Miss Rossi, I apologize for the disturbance. Your sister's room is secure. Make sure she gets her physical therapy at 2 o'clock, Tessa said calmly. She slipped the flash drive back into her pocket, turned around, and walked out to the waiting SUV. The fire was roaring in the massive stone hearth of the library when Tessa returned. The snowstorm had escalated into a blizzard, blanketing the estate in a thick, insulating white. Vincent was sitting near the fire, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He wasn't at his desk. He was just a man watching the flames. Tessa took off her coat, shaking the snow from the wool, and hung it on the rack near the door. She walked over to the leather sofa opposite his chair and sat down with a heavy, exhausted sigh. She kicked off her boots. "Harrington?" Vincent asked, not looking away from the fire. "Neutralized," Tessa replied. "He won't be a problem again. Neither will she." "Did you give him the drive?" "No." Tessa pulled the piece of black plastic from her pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table between them. "I keep my leverage. That's what you taught me." Vincent finally turned his head. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It changed his entire demeanor, softening the harsh angles of his jaw, erasing the cynical mob boss, and leaving only the man underneath. "You're learning," he murmured. "I had a good teacher." The room fell quiet. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence that used to dominate the house when Arya was there. It was a comfortable, earned silence. The silence of two people who had fought a war together and won. Vincent set his glass down on the side table. He engaged the motors on his chair, rolling forward until his knees were nearly touching the edge of the sofa where Tessa sat. He turned the chair off. "Tessa," he said quietly. She looked up. The firelight danced in her hazel eyes. "When they shot me," Vincent began his voice, rough. "I thought my life ended on that pavement. I thought the chair was just a coffin with wheels. Arya proved me right." She looked at me and saw a corpse. He reached out, resting his heavy hands on the armrests, leaning his upper body forward. "You walked into this room, looked at the exact same broken body, and saw a king." Tessa held his gaze. She didn't move away. "A crown isn't carried in your legs, Vincent. It's carried in your chest. I am a paralyzed man," Vincent stated, laying the brutal truth bare between them. He needed her to understand the permanence of it. "I will never walk you down a street. I will never stand up to pull out your chair. The things a normal man can give you, I can't." "I've met normal men," Tessa said softly. "They run when things get hard. They break under pressure. I don't want a normal man." She shifted forward on the sofa. She reached out and placed her hands over his where they gripped the armrests. Her touch was fire against his skin. "I want the man who tore apart a city to protect my family," she whispered. Vincent let out a shaky breath. He unclasped his hands, sliding his arms around her waist, pulling her forward. Tessa moved seamlessly, sliding off the edge of the sofa and kneeling on the rug between his ruined legs. She rested her hands on his broad shoulders, leaning up. Vincent buried his hands in her hair, pulling her face to his. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce, and entirely grounded in the ugly, beautiful reality of their lives. It was the taste of bourbon and the smell of wood smoke. It was the desperate culmination of months of suppressed tension, of shared battles, of a man finding his soul again in the hands of the woman who refused to let him die. Vincent pulled her closer, his massive chest heaving against hers, his heart hammering a frantic, living rhythm against his ribs. He felt whole. For the first time since the bullet tore through his spine, he felt entirely, completely whole. A week later, the dining room was full again. The capos sat around the mahogany table. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of business. The winter sun streamed through the windows, cutting across the crystal glasses. Vincent sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair. He wore a charcoal suit, his posture immaculate, his eyes sharp. He was commanding the room with effortless authority, outlining the new shipping routes and laying down the law for the Cicero expansion. "And if the Russians push back?" Paulie asked, tapping an ash into his tray. "They won't," Vincent said smoothly. "Because they know if they touch one of our trucks, I will burn their port to the waterline." The men nodded in unison. There was no hesitation, no sideways glances. The king was firmly on his throne. The heavy oak doors opened. Tessa walked in. She wore a sleek, dark, burgundy dress that fell perfectly to her knees, her hair styled loose over her shoulders. She carried a leather portfolio. The capos stopped talking immediately. To a man, they sat up straighter. They didn't look at her with the leering disrespect they reserved for mafia wives. They looked at her with the cautious, profound respect reserved for an equal. They knew who held the keys to the kingdom. Tessa didn't walk behind Vincent's wheelchair. She didn't stand in the corner like a shadow. She walked directly to the right side of the table, pulling out the heavy mahogany chair positioned immediately next to Vincent. She sat down, placing the portfolio on the table, and crossed her legs. Vincent looked at her, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He reached under the table, his hand finding hers, their fingers interlocking in the hidden space between them. "Now," Vincent said, turning his cold, commanding gaze back to his men. "Let's talk about the future. If you loved watching Vincent reclaim his empire and Tessa prove that true power comes from loyalty, smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a gritty, emotional mafia romance where the underdog rises to the top. What was your favorite moment, Tessa? Confronting the judge or Vincent destroying Dominic without throwing a punch? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another intense audio drama.